Good evening, everyone. I'm Professor Richard D. Wolff, and tonight we need to step back from the headlines, from the chaos and noise, and look deeply at what this latest eruption, the bombing of Tel Aviv by dozens of Yemeni missiles, really signifies. Because this isn't just another episode of violence in a troubled region, it's a symptom, a powerful, alarming signal of something much larger unfolding in our world economy and our global political system. Tel Aviv under fire. Words that for decades seemed unthinkable to many watching the Middle East from afar. Yet here we are, facing a moment that has shattered assumptions and rewritten the region's geopolitical playbook. The recent wave of Yemeni missiles striking Tel Aviv did not just pierce Israeli air defenses, it pierced the illusion of control that global powers believed they still held over a volatile and deeply divided region. The world watched as smoke rose over one of the most advanced and fortified cities in the Middle East, and the question that echoed across newsrooms and war rooms alike was simple. How did this happen, and what does it mean? This event represents more than an attack. It's a statement, a shockwave that reverberates far beyond Israel's borders. Tel Aviv, often seen as a symbol of Israel's economic vitality and technological dominance, suddenly found itself vulnerable. This vulnerability sends a message not only to Israel but to its Western allies, particularly the United States, that no system of defense, however advanced, can indefinitely protect a state from the consequences of regional discontent and global imbalance. Yemen, a nation long devastated by conflict and economic collapse, has managed to project power in a way few thought possible. The symbolism is striking. One of the poorest nations on earth, targeting one of the most militarily sophisticated, it's David and Goliath retold, not in mythic form but in modern warfare. The psychological impact of this attack cannot be overstated. For years, Israel has maintained a perception of near invincibility through its Iron Dome defense system, a technological marvel supported and funded by the United States. Yet, when dozens of missiles breached that confidence, it sent a jolt through both the Israeli public and international observers. The question is no longer whether Israel can defend itself, but how long such a system can sustain itself under the pressure of a new kind of asymmetrical warfare. This is not a battle of equals. It is a confrontation driven by desperation, ideology, and a deep sense of injustice. Yemen's move demonstrates that power in today's world no longer depends solely on wealth or resources. It also rests on will, narrative, and the ability to disrupt. There's a profound irony here. Tel Aviv has long been a beacon of modernity, the city of innovation, startups, and global connectivity, yet within minutes, that world of progress collided with the brutal realities of geopolitical rage. Ordinary citizens who had once looked to the horizon with optimism now found themselves under sirens and explosions. The contrast is almost cinematic. Skyscrapers and missile trails sharing the same skyline, a chilling reminder that no nation, however prosperous, can isolate itself from the tremors of global instability. The bombing of Tel Aviv is not just a military incident, it's a political and psychological turning point. It tells us that the Middle East has entered a new phase, one defined not by conventional power structures, but by unpredictability. It forces a reckoning with the limitations of deterrence, the fragility of alliances, and the dangerous intersection between economics, ideology, and conflict. In a world increasingly divided between the powerful and the powerless, this attack is more than an explosion. It's an eruption of resentment, history, and consequence. And if the world doesn't pay attention to what this symbolizes, it may soon find that Tel Aviv is not the only city under fire, but a warning flare for what's to come. Yemen's defiance in striking Tel Aviv is not merely a display of military aggression, it is a seismic signal of shifting power in the global order. The idea that one of the poorest and most war-torn nations in the world could successfully launch dozens of missiles toward one of the most fortified cities in the Middle East challenges everything we thought we knew about hierarchy, influence, and deterrence. It's a headline that feels almost surreal. A country crippled by famine, sanctions, and years of relentless bombing, now capable of projecting force across borders and shaking the confidence of a major Western ally. How does a nation brought to its knees by war rise up to strike at the heart of global power structures? That question alone is a powerful reflection of a changing world. What we are witnessing is the unraveling of a geopolitical script that has been in place since the end of World War II. For decades, the global South has been on the receiving end of Western intervention, militarily, politically, and economically. Yemen, in particular, has been viewed as a perpetual victim of conflict, caught in the crossfire of regional rivalries and great power politics. But this act of defiance, this strike against Israel, symbolizes something more profound: the breaking of silence, the assertion of agency from a nation long dismissed as powerless. It reflects a broader pattern emerging across the globe: the rise of voices and movements unwilling to remain subordinate to the traditional centers of power in Washington, London, or Brussels. This moment must be understood not simply as an act of war, but as an act of rebellion. Rebellion against a world order that has for too long imposed its will through sanctions, occupations, and economic coercion. In many ways, Yemen's missiles are not just aimed at Tel Aviv, they are aimed at the architecture of global inequality itself. Each launch signals frustration with decades of exploitation, neglect, and moral hypocrisy from the powers that have shaped the modern world. And this frustration is not confined to Yemen. It echoes across the developing world, where nations are increasingly aligning with alternative power blocs, seeking leverage and dignity outside of Western frameworks. The most striking element of Yemen's defiance is that it was never supposed to happen. The country was meant to remain crippled, its infrastructure shattered, its population exhausted. Yet in defying these expectations, Yemen has exposed a critical weakness in the global system: the illusion that dominance can last forever. When economic desperation and political humiliation combine, they produce a force that cannot easily be suppressed. And this force, when directed strategically, can challenge even the most powerful adversaries. Yemen's defiance, therefore, becomes a case study in the shifting nature of modern power, one that no longer depends solely on wealth or alliances, but on will, strategy, and the capacity to disrupt. The symbolism of this act ripples outward. It tells every marginalized nation that power can be redefined. It warns established powers that control, no matter how technologically advanced, cannot silence the consequences of injustice indefinitely. The global balance is tilting, not necessarily in favor of any single nation, but toward a more multipolar reality, one where the periphery begins to push back against the center. Yemen's defiance is not an isolated incident. It's a reflection of a world waking up from the long shadow of Western dominance. And if history teaches us anything, it's that once the marginalized find their voice, the world can no longer pretend not to hear. The collapse of U.S. global influence is not occurring overnight, but moment by moment, one crisis, one rebellion, one act of defiance at a time. The missile strike on Tel Aviv by Yemeni forces is not just an isolated geopolitical shock, it is a vivid symbol of a larger truth that Washington can no longer ignore. For decades, the United States stood as the unchallenged arbiter of global order, dictating the rules, defining alliances, and enforcing its vision of stability through military, financial, and ideological power. But today, the world is no longer listening with the same obedience. The fear that once sustained American dominance has begun to fade, replaced by resistance, resentment, and alternative centers of gravity emerging across the globe. The unipolar moment is over, and the world is writing a new chapter without waiting for Washington's approval. The attack on Tel Aviv encapsulates this shift in a single dramatic scene. Israel, one of America's closest and most strategically protected allies, has long represented the extension of U.S. influence in the Middle East, a forward base of Western interests. To see that very ally under fire from a nation the U.S. and its coalition have spent years trying to subdue reveals the cracks in the system of deterrence and dominance that once defined American power. The message is clear: U.S. protection no longer guarantees security. Its alliances, once seen as ironclad, now appear fragile under the weight of changing realities. When a struggling nation like Yemen can directly challenge U.S. influence by striking a key ally, it's not just a military event, it's a political earthquake. The reasons for this erosion run deep. For years, America's global posture relied on economic leverage, military superiority, and the projection of moral authority. But the credibility of each of these pillars has been steadily undermined. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan drained not only resources, but also legitimacy. Economic sanctions, once a potent tool of coercion, are losing their sting as new alliances and alternative trade systems emerge, particularly between China, Russia, and parts of the global south. Even the US dollar, long the backbone of its influence, faces quiet but persistent challenges as nations seek to reduce dependence on American-controlled financial systems. Power once centralized is now dispersing. Meanwhile, the American narrative of moral leadership, democracy, freedom, human rights has been weakened by contradictions and double standards. Nations see a pattern. Washington preaches peace while fueling wars, champions sovereignty while interfering abroad, and speaks of justice while supporting systems of inequality. This dissonance has created an opening for other powers to step in, promising partnerships based on mutual interest rather than dominance. As a result, countries once firmly aligned with the U.S. are now diversifying their loyalties, negotiating with both East and West, and redefining their paths independently. The collapse of influence does not mean immediate disappearance. Rather, it's a fading of fear and the rise of alternatives. America still wields enormous economic and military power, but its ability to dictate terms, to shape global outcomes, is diminishing. The Yemeni missiles over Tel Aviv are a metaphor for that decline. Small, defiant, and symbolically devastating. They show that even the mightiest empire cannot control the tide of history forever. What we are witnessing is not simply a geopolitical shift, but the slow disintegration of an illusion. The illusion that one nation could rule a world increasingly unwilling to be ruled. Every explosion we witness on the global stage, every act of defiance, every war headline, beneath it all lies an economic story that too often goes untold. The roots of modern conflict are not just buried in politics, religion, or ideology. They are embedded deep within the soil of economic inequality and exploitation. When we look at the escalating tensions in the Middle East, such as Yemen's missile strike on Tel Aviv, what we are really seeing is the outward expression of decades of economic despair, injustice, and dependency imposed upon the world's poorer nations. Wars may be fought with missiles and drones, but they are born out of hunger, unemployment, and the suffocating weight of economic subjugation. The battlefield is only the surface. The real war begins in the marketplace. For generations, global power has been built upon economic systems designed to benefit the few at the expense of the many. Western economies, led by the United States and its allies, constructed a world order where wealth flowed upward, extracted from developing nations through unfair trade deals, resource exploitation, and debt dependency. The result has been catastrophic for the global South: crumbling infrastructures, staggering poverty, and populations trapped in cycles of dependency. When people lose hope of economic stability, they lose faith in diplomacy. And when nations lose faith in diplomacy, war becomes the language of last resort. Yemen's defiance, therefore, is not just military. It is economic retaliation against a system that has left it impoverished and invisible. Economic injustice fuels resentment, and resentment fuels resistance. The Middle East for decades has been a theater of both imperial ambition and resource extraction. Oil wealth that should have built prosperity for local populations has instead enriched a narrow elite and sustained Western consumption. Meanwhile, sanctions, blockades, and military interventions have kept weaker nations economically paralyzed. Yemen is a prime example, a country stripped of opportunity, forced into desperation. In such conditions, missiles become symbols of dignity, conflict becomes a currency of recognition. When people cannot trade in global markets, they trade in defiance. But the economics of global conflict are not just about poverty, they are also about profit. Every war fills the coffers of arms manufacturers, energy corporations, and financial institutions that thrive on instability. The so-called defense industry has become one of the most lucrative sectors of modern capitalism, its profits spiking with every escalation. In that sense, conflict is not a failure of the system, it is a function of it. War creates demand for weapons, reconstruction, and control, ensuring that capital continues to circulate among those already at the top. The ordinary citizens who lose their homes, livelihoods, and lives are merely collateral damage in an economic machine that sees them as expendable. When we strip away the rhetoric of patriotism and ideology, what remains is a brutal truth. Global conflict is often the visible symptom of an economic disease. The inequality that fuels discontent abroad is mirrored by inequality within powerful nations themselves. The same economic model that enriches elites in New York, London, or Tel Aviv impoverishes farmers in Yemen, laborers in Gaza, and workers across the developing world. Until that imbalance is confronted, missiles will continue to fly, not because nations crave war, but because people everywhere crave justice. War in its modern form is not merely the breakdown of diplomacy, it is the inevitable byproduct of a global economic system driven by profit and competition. Under capitalism, conflict is not an accident, it is a business model. Every missile launched, every tank deployed, every reconstruction contract signed. These are all transactions within an economy that feeds on instability. The horrifying truth is that war is not only permitted in the capitalist system, it is incentivized. It generates profit, consolidates power, and sustains industries that rely on perpetual fear. When one begins to examine who truly benefits from the flames of war, the pattern becomes unmistakably clear. Corporations, investors, and political elites gain, while ordinary people lose everything. The global arms industry stands as one of the most revealing examples of this dynamic. Each conflict becomes an opportunity for growth, each regional crisis a surge in demand. The world's largest weapons manufacturers, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, BAE Systems, see their stock prices rise every time violence escalates. War has become commodified. Human suffering is measured in quarterly earnings reports. Capitalism thrives on movement of goods, of capital, and yes, of conflict. Peace, by contrast, offers no immediate profit. It halts production, slows consumption, and undermines the very forces that drive accumulation. Thus, while politicians may speak of peace in public, the economic machinery of war hums quietly beneath every promise. The relationship between capitalism and conflict goes deeper than mere profiteering. At its core, capitalism depends on expansion, the endless pursuit of new markets, new resources, and new labor to exploit. When those frontiers close, competition among powers intensifies, and war becomes the tool through which capital breaks through stagnation. The destruction caused by war is not viewed as tragedy in boardrooms, it is seen as opportunity. Cities in ruins mean reconstruction contracts. Nations in debt mean dependency and privatization. From the ashes of war, capital finds fertile ground to grow again. In this way, war becomes not a failure of capitalism, but its most brutal expression, the cleansing fire that resets the game for another round of profit. Even the rhetoric surrounding modern warfare is carefully packaged for consumption. We are told that wars are fought for freedom, democracy, or security. In reality, they are often fought to secure resources, maintain trade routes, or protect corporate interests abroad. The people who fight and die rarely share in the spoils of victory. Instead, they return home to the same economic uncertainty that drove their nations into conflict in the first place. The poor fight wars engineered by the rich, and when the smoke clears, those same elites rebuild what they destroyed at a price. Every major conflict of the last century, from World War II to Iraq and beyond, has demonstrated that capitalism's engine of growth runs fastest when fueled by destruction. The defense budgets swell, industries boom, and the cycle repeats. Peace, while noble, remains unprofitable. War, though catastrophic, is economically efficient, and so under capitalism, war becomes not an exception to the rule but the rule itself, the ultimate product of a system that turns even tragedy into opportunity. There comes a point in every civilization when the weight of its own contradictions begins to crush it, and today the world stands on that edge. The missile strike on Tel Aviv, the chaos in the Middle East, the unraveling of global alliances, these are not just political events, they are moral signals, warning that our global economic order has lost its balance and its conscience. What we are witnessing is not merely geopolitical turbulence, but a profound human and ethical crisis. For decades, we have built an economy that rewards greed, exploits weakness, and masks inequality with the illusion of progress. But as the wars multiply and the suffering deepens, the moral bankruptcy of that system becomes impossible to ignore. This is not just a time for analysis, it is a time for reckoning. At the heart of this reckoning lies a simple but uncomfortable truth. The world's economic architecture is built on exclusion. The wealth of a few depends on the poverty of many. The prosperity of certain nations is financed by the deprivation of others. For generations, the global South has been treated as a resource pit and a dumping ground, a place to extract profit, not share progress. When nations like Yemen lash out, when people rise in anger, what they are really rejecting is the moral hierarchy that keeps them on their knees. Their missiles may be weapons, but their defiance is a demand for dignity. And unless the global economy learns to distribute opportunity as well as it distributes blame, these eruptions will only grow more frequent and more devastating. The world's leaders often speak of peace, stability, and development, but their actions tell another story. They continue to invest more in weapons than in welfare, more in defense than in dignity. Every dollar spent on militarization is a dollar stolen from education, healthcare, and human survival. The same global institutions that could eradicate poverty are instead structured to protect wealth. The International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the corporate empires of the West do not function as engines of equality. They function as mechanisms of control. Their moral language hides economic exploitation. Their promises of reform conceal the perpetuation of dependency. The global poor have become the collateral damage of a system too addicted to profit to remember its purpose. But the reckoning that looms ahead will not be purely economic. It will be moral, a confrontation with what humanity has allowed itself to become. We have normalized suffering to preserve markets, accepted inequality as efficiency, and celebrated power even when it destroys lives. The violence that erupts across the globe is not random. It is the echo of this moral silence. It asks a question the global elite cannot answer. How long can a world built on injustice sustain itself? The future will be determined by whether we can summon the courage to rethink our priorities, to place humanity above profit, fairness above power, and cooperation above domination. Economic reform alone will not be enough. It must be accompanied by an awakening of conscience, because if we fail to reckon with the moral decay that underlies our systems, no wall, no army, and no economy will be strong enough to protect what's left of our shared humanity.